Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted, and today's topic is Lecture 22, The Old South. Now before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on your video, jot down the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the top. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, be able to connect the key terms to each other and to their larger historical context. And with that, let's begin. Now, we left off last time, we're talking about the presidency of Andrew Jackson. We've been talking about the market revolution in general. When you go back in time again, back to that period of, the 18 teens, post-war of 1812 period. But the reality is, with the Indian removal of Andrew Jackson, and even before this, but the continual push westward, we have these vast amounts of land to the west that we have yet to settle. And the question we have to ask ourselves as Americans in the 1820s is, what do we want that land to be? And of course, if you live in the north or you live in the south, you'll have very different answers to these questions. But we'll talk about the north later. But for right now, let's focus on the Old South, as it was called. Now, when I mention the term the Old South to you, what is the first thing that pops in your mind? What do you envision? Well, the reality is most people have this vision in mind. It's the Gone with the Wind vision. Slaves, plantations. I assume most of you will think cotton, because cotton was king. Remember, we haven't even talked about cotton really yet. Big poofy dresses. And of course, the romanticized version of the South was right there. There was a land of cavaliers and cotton fields called the Old South. Here in this pretty world, gallantry took its last bow. Here was the last ever to be seen of knights and their ladies fair, of master and of slave. Look for it only in books, for it is no more than a dream remembered, a civilization gone with the wind. Now, very poetic, very articulate. Also extremely racist and romanticized version that would think that the Old South was a good place to live. Of master and of slave. A dream world. Of course it was a dream if you're a rich white person. But the reality is, we think of slavery was everywhere in the South, and it was. But the reality is the vast majority of whites do not own slaves. Now, say 1800s. You might get a percentage, 35, 40, maybe even 45% of whites own at least one slave. But as the 1800s progress, fewer and fewer people actually own a slave. And it really begins to consolidate into a few large plantations. Remember, the average white person in America in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1860s doesn't have a large plantation, doesn't own a slave. And the reality is, the South itself is not monolithic. The South itself is not just cotton and plantations. In fact, they're referred to as the regional South. And again, you have two different regions of it. You have the upper South, that Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina. There's cooler weather up here, and therefore cotton is not growing up here. Instead, you grow tobacco and wheat. Then you have the geographic lower South, the deep South, the SEC country, if you will. South Carolina, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Texas. Because of the better climate, the warmer climate, the longer growing season, cotton will grow well here. As you can see from the map, cotton is going to be king here. And so what we have this diversity then when it comes to what you produce. As a result of this, there's also a diversity in the institution of slavery. So again, even back in 1800, the vast majority of whites do not own slaves. And as the 1800s progresses up to the Civil War in 1861, fewer and fewer percentages of whites actually owned slaves. But, this is the big but, even if you do not own a slave, you still support the institution of slavery. Because slavery is not just economic. Slavery is a social institution. It is an institution of control whereby you are controlling and demeaning and dehumanizing another human being. Yes, it is a labor system designed to make a profit. But for Southerners, even if you don't own a slave for economic purposes, you buy into and support the institution. I love this quote by John C. Calhoun. It's an evil, vile quote, but it really epitomizes the thought. Of course, this is 1837. You see the date there. He says, quote, "Many in the South once believed that slavery was a moral or political evil. That folly and delusion are gone. And we see it now in its true light and regard it as the most safe and stable basis for free institutions in the world." Again, John C. Calhoun, distinguished Southern politician, former vice president. Now, so what has changed so much over this time period? That this time period refers to the Old South. And part of it is the development of King Cotton. Now, the last time we talked about the economy of the South, we were still focusing heavily on rice and tobacco in the Carolinas back in the colonial days. By the time the market revolution hits, though, the South becomes a cotton kingdom. Why? Well, the answer is that cotton, first of all, grows well. In the deep South, these developing states, and as we push further and further west into places like Alabama, Mississippi, and to Texas eventually, the warm climates make cotton production very, well, desirable. In addition, tobacco and rice, because of overproduction, are becoming less profitable. In addition, remember that Industrial Revolution in the North and the Market Revolution of textile like Lowell? Yeah, those rely on Southern cotton growing. So even though the North is going to eventually ban slavery, and they will, by 1860, no other state has slavery, they're still going to heavily rely on the institution of slavery because they buy the cotton from the South, which is produced largely by slaves. But it wasn't always that way. And the reality is, Americans tried to experiment with all these new crops, trying to find the next great cash crop. And cotton was eventually decided upon. But initially, it was a really bad, inefficient crop. In fact, circa 1800, circa 1790s, cotton was considered a failure as a cash crop. Because you got to realize, in order to produce cotton, you have the little cotton ball you see in the picture there. Well, inside there, if you've never seen one in person, it's full of little seeds that are really sticky. They're very sharp. They hurt when you pick it. And these cotton balls, in order to use the cotton, you have to remove all these sticky seeds. So you have to pick it by hand, pick the cotton ball by hand. Then you have to proceed to have a slave sit there and clean seeds out of the cotton ball all day long. And so circa 1790, it took one slave 10 hours to pick and clean 1 pound of cotton. Repeat that. One slave took 10 hours to pick and clean 1 pound of cotton. That's a very inefficient crop. That's not going to do much. And this is also one of the reasons why some of the early founding fathers like Jefferson did argue that slavery would naturally die off. Again, it was no longer necessary. Tobacco, rice was dwindling, less need for slaves. There's no new cash crop yet. Cotton was not efficient. However, everything changes in 1793 thanks to this man on the right, Eli Whitney. Now, in 1793, he invents what's called the cotton gin. It's a very simple machine. You put the cotton on the left side, you crank the handle, and it rolls the cotton balls through these metal bars. And what it does keeps rolling through it is it begins to separate the seed from the ball. Now, this is a crude, simple machine that would improve over time, obviously. But in 1793, the cotton gin will revolutionize cotton production. Because remember how one slave could produce 1 pound of cotton in 10 hours? Yeah. That same slave using the cotton gin can now produce 50 pounds of cotton one day. So we went from 1 pound per day to 50 pounds a day, thanks to Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Again, before the gin, the prevailing thought was slavery would die out naturally. But when slaves could now be used to cultivate millions of pounds of cotton for markets all over the world, slavery became even more entrenched. And you see the stats there. In 1790, they were exporting 900 bales of cotton per year. 5 years later, after you implement the cotton gin, up to 28,000. By 1800, just 5 years after that, 92,000. To the point where in 1860 they're producing, the South is 5.7 million bales of cotton exports a year. That's 2/3 of the world's cotton, all on the backs of slaves. And of course, this includes selling to the north, to the industrial centers, and these textile mills. And kind of fun little side fact, Eli Whitney never made a dime off his machine. You know, as Eli Whitney actually created the cotton gin, he was very proud of this machine. He thought he was going to make life easier for slaves. And in fact, he made it far worse because now the South had a cash crop to entrench slavery. And he never makes a dime off the machine because he never gets it patented in time, and everyone copies it, and he dies pretty much penniless. So I told you they're selling this cotton all over the world, including to the north, yes. But they're also starting to sell it to these new western states. And thanks to the transportation revolution, the market revolution, and thanks to this production of cotton, we rapidly begin to expand and look for new territory in the West to produce more natural resources and also to feed the country. Because as more and more industries in the Northeast, as cotton takes over the South, someone's got to feed our growing population. And yes, that includes slave population, as you see the stat on the screen. We will actually increase our slave population from 1.5 to 4 million slaves from 1820 to 1860 as cotton begins to boom even more. And so, as these new states out west want to enter the Union, the question becomes, do you allow them to expand slavery there or not? Now, the answer should be no. Remember the Northwest Ordinance? It said slavery will not be permitted there. But that becomes a sticking point. And so in 1819, we have our first major crisis. The nation in 1819 had a perfect number, had 22 states, 11 slave, 11 free, which means balance in the Senate. However, in 1819, the state of Missouri wanted to become, the territory of Missouri wanted to become a state. And their entrance threatened to throw the balance of power to slave states' favor, because Missouri wanted to be a slave state. And this became a bitter debate in Congress. Again, you could have used the Northwest Ordinance, but they chose not to. And again, the reason the Northwest Ordinance was not chosen here was because they said, the southern states argued that, if Congress is saying that these new states aren't allowed to have the choice of slavery like the old states did, then by definition, these new states are inherently less free, less rights, than older states were. I'm going to repeat that. So because if you apply the Northwest Ordinance and give Congress the power to limit slavery expanding to the West, each new state that enters the Union, they argue, will be less free than older states because older states got to choose for themselves on the issue of slavery. And if Congress controls this decision, then these new states will have fewer rights than the original ones did. And so they went to work and said, okay, fine, Northwest Ordinance, you're out. Again, I don't think the Northwest Ordinance actually did anything right. Ever got actually applied right. Instead, let's talk about our old friend Henry Clay. Yes, he's still around 1820. He decides he wants to settle the question of slavery and the expansion of slavery once and for all. And in 1820, he pens the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Now, very simple, is in 1820, Missouri wants to be a slave state. Fine, Missouri can be a slave state. But we are also going to admit Maine as a free state. This way, we maintain the balance in the Senate. But he also wants to end any future discussion as well over the issue of slavery. And to do so, he proposes what's called the 3630 line. So part one of the Missouri Compromise is Missouri is going to be a slave state, Maine will be a free state, thus preserving Senate balance. The second part of the compromise is that we're going to draw a line on the map. And any future state that is south of that line, 3630 parallel, will be a slave state. Any state north of that line will be a free state. Now, why does the North agree to this? Well, you look at all that territory up there, they have the potential. Remember, on the map, as you see on the screen, everything south of the line other than Arkansas there is not owned by the United States. It is owned by Mexico. Well, this actually 1820 is still Spain until 1821. Everything north of that line, though, other than the little Oregon area that's still owned by the British, is still the unorganized territory of the United States. So the North says, well, okay, we can agree to this compromise because the potential is there'll be a lot more free states in the future. So you might ask, well, why does the South agree to this? Well, the argument was all that territory, that unorganized territory, was not good fertile land, and therefore slaves were not necessary anyway. Again, it's kind of an argument they just kind of had to take, even though it makes not the most logical sense as far as the whole Senate power thing. Now, the compromise was criticized by Southerners, but they would acquiesce on this idea that some slaves are needed in bad fertile areas. The legacy, though, is more interesting because while it was intended to put to bed the question of slavery once and for all, ultimately it entrenches slavery even more in the South. And look what you see in your map right now. The framers, Henry Clay and those who co-authored it with him, are literally drawing a line of demarcation between us and them. Good versus evil. Even though they didn't look at it at that point in those terms yet, they are physically separating our country into two separate regions, one slave, one free. Even though there's a few states, obviously in the upper South, Missouri included, above that line. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that the number of slaves dramatically increased from 1.5 million all the way up to 4 million between 1800 and 1860. How does this happen? Well, the reality is, in 1808, we did abolish the international slave trade. But what emerges instead is what's called the domestic slave trade. And this domestic slave trade was opened up between older slave states in the upper South, like Virginia, Maryland, and they would begin to sell their excess slaves. Remember, tobacco and rice are dwindling. So they have excess slaves in the upper South. They begin to sell their slaves to the deep South. These new states like Alabama, Mississippi, and eventually Texas. And because cotton is the new big push going toward the west, again, toward Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, more and more slaves are needed to be sold from the upper South to the lower South. And we have this tremendous concentration in the lower South and the deep South of slaves. And when you increase the concentration of slaves, you also increase the number of natural or forced natural reproductions of slaves. And thus the domestic slave trade began to be a way for a explosion in the slave population. Now again, remember, most of these slaves, they arrive in the Deep South, not from reproduction, but from the domestic slave trade. You a picture of it there. And you see the stat there, between 1830 and 1860, in just Virginia alone, over 300,000 slaves were sent south. Of course, when this happens, remember, you have a couple options. If you're in the upper South, you have a couple options. You can either A, uproot your family and your business and move to the lower South and start doing cotton, or B, just sell off your excess slaves, take the money, and remain where you're at. And many would choose the second option. They would sell off part of their slaves. They often breaking up families in the process. They don't care about the family. Remember, they're seen as 3/5 of a person or subhuman in the eyes of whites. And thus, this domestic slave trade is extremely harsh and detrimental to slave families. And they begin to sell them off and sell them to the Deep South. African Americans are treated as property. They're being put up at slave auctions. They're not being treated as human beings. They're being treated just as you would cattle. Again, picture yourself going to the Houston Livestock and Rodeo Show and going to the auction pens for cattle and steers and sheep and everything else that's there. And they're being inspected at every orifice. Their genitalia are being looked at to see if they're diseased. Their mouths are being opened. They're examining their teeth for disease. They're standing there buck naked as a white person inspects them as they would a cow. Then to haggle over the price of buying a human being as if they were a piece of property. And then, if the owner dies, often there would be auctions. And so, these were estate auctions or estate sales. And so in newspapers, they begin to carry the prices. You see it on your screen right now. So someone died, and an auction house is now going to auction off the house and the barn and the tractor and the tools and the work hands. Just as they would the cow or the horse or the plow, they will also sell off the slaves. And they will increasingly fetch larger and larger prices, because as the domestic slave trade, as the international slave trade dries up, as the domestic slave trade begins to go in full force, the price, the value of an African American slave skyrockets. So as you can see on the image there, they're not terribly priced there, $700 to $1,000. This was about 1845 though. So let's give you some numbers here. 1845, a prime field hand, in other words, a male in his 20s, was valued at about $600. By the way, today's value at several $1,000s. By 1860, that same 20s prime field hand male was now selling at $1,800. So in just 15 years, between 1845 and 1860, the value or price of that prime field hand male in his 20s went from $600 to $1,800. In today's money, approximately $50,000 for one piece of property, a human being. The price tripled in just 15 years. As you can see, how much money is invested in the institution of slavery. And of course, at times you're going to see some slaves are just purchased for reproduction's sake. Another ad for you. See the ad for 55 prime Negroes. This is the one I usually hand out in class. This is a horrific image, but from a newspaper for a slave auction. And I would like to hand this out in class and just have students look it over and look at the end that stick out to them. So I'm going to pick out a few that are common ones for students. So you see, Lizzie, number 3, she's 30. She's a rice worker, but she's unsound. She's a little crazy. So she's valued very low at $300, but she's still sought after. Most people like to go down to pick out immediately someone like, the Lunesta on the top. He's a prime rice planter. Or number 17, Coolidge. He's 29 years old, at the end of that prime age, but he's still a rice hand, and he's a blacksmith. He has a skill, so he's valued at a high price of $12.75. But look down at number 30, Melly Ann. She's a house worker who's a smart yellow girl. No, that is not a slang term for an Asian person. She's a mixed race slave who's a houseworker, which means most likely her mother was a houseworker slave, who was raped by their owner, hence why Melly Ann is mixed race. And she is now being sold for a high price of $12.50 because her job is to be a house slave, which means because she's lighter skinned, maybe a little more attractive, her job is to reproduce for the master, which will usually be by forced rape. Look over the list, take a minute, hit pause, look at this list. And just notice that you're treating human beings with just a few words and putting a dollar value on their lives. And even the 60-year-old Uncle Tim is worth $60 because he can deal with mules. He has some skill. 18, Bessie. She's only $250. She's 69 years old. She's an infirm, but she can sew. Remember, usually you don't want to buy someone that old because you have to take care of them in their old years. And the less work they do for you, the less money they make for you, therefore they're not a good investment. Remember, so slaves were bought for a variety of purposes. Some were bought to work in the fields. Some were bought for skill. Some were bought, many young girls were bought just to reproduce, especially people like Melly Ann, who is just 19 years old. She's basically being sold to be raped by her master. Now I want to show you, if you get a chance, watch 12 Years a Slave. There's a great slave auction scene in there, but copyright issues make it very difficult to get on this computer. However, I do want to show you another quick scene from a slave auction, just so you get an idea of how things acted and how much they were treated like, well, property.
1841, New Orleans, ground zero for the slave trade. It's auction day.
I'm going to hit pause real quick just to point out. The reason New Orleans is a hub for slave trades, yes, it was the slave trade in the upper South and lower South, but in the port of New Orleans, they were smuggling not only, as you go back to my map a few slides ago, you saw how they were shipped around from the Carolinas and Virginia down to New Orleans by boat. And also they were smuggling slaves from the Caribbean still in through the port of New Orleans as well, which makes New Orleans very important for that reason.
Today, every slave fears the most. In the first half of the 19th century, over 500,000 slaves are sold at auction. It's a business worth $2 billion to the Southern economy. Since the cotton boom, the value of slaves has skyrocketed. Now men cost $1,000, women $800, children $500. Solomon Northrop, an educated free man from the North, was kidnapped into slavery.
He would make us hold up our heads, walk us briskly back and forth, while customers would feel our hands and arms and bodies. Make us open up our mouths and show our teeth, precisely as a jockey examines a horse which he is about to barter for or purchase.
Now, no, while this is being done, you see them fully clothed, wearing pretty good-looking clothes, actually, especially compared with the era. Often this was done while the slaves were naked because they wanted to be able to inspect them even further in a more detail through every orifice to make sure they're not being diseased. Just to keep that in mind as you're watching, this is a very clean version of this.
Scars upon a slave's back were considered evidence of a rebellious or unruly spirit and hurt his sale.
90% of all African Americans are slaves. 4 million men, women, and children.
We had based this country on everyone having inalienable rights to freedom and equality, and yet we created a system of abject persecution.
Slaves are fattened for auction. like livestock. Dark-skinned men are bought for the fields, light-skinned women for the house. Traders lie about their ages, even dye a slave's gray hairs.
For the plantation owners, it was like just going to your local supermarket to get sugar or flour. They had become so desensitized to the humanity of the slave that they did not see them as human beings.
Buyers demand the most fertile slaves for breeding. The most expensive are light-skinned teenage virgins. Rape is common. Eliza's from Estate Plantation. She's being sold with her 2 children, Emily and Randall. In Louisiana, it's illegal for children under 11 to be taken from their parents. It happens all the time.
140 years is not a really long time in the context of history. So it's hard for me to believe that blacks didn't have any rights here. They weren't treated as human beings. They were treated like animals, essentially.
Sir, please.
Over half the sales at auction will tear a family apart.
If you've ever been 8, to think of being separated from your mother and your father and sold and you'll never see them again. The horror of that, the poignancy of all of that, and yet that's the kind of thing that happened across the South up until the end of slavery.
Okay, my final offer. $900. The woman there, $700.
Please, buy my child. Sir!
I have seen mothers kissing for the last time the faces of their dead offspring, but never have I seen such an exhibition of intense grief as when Eliza was parted from her child.
Come on, here you go.
Now, of course, this is a rendition of it. It was much worse in real life. And of course, if you want to see this 12 Years a Slave version, is the story, of course, Solomon Northup, and Eliza's in there as well. Now, I start out this lecture, though, by saying the vast majority of Southerners don't own a slave. In fact, by the time we get to 1850s, somewhere between 25 and 30% of Southern whites actually own a slave. Think about that for a minute. About 1 out of every 4 Southern whites actually owns a slave. That's a very small percentage, and yet they're the ones that are pushing this institution. And even if you don't own a slave, you buy into this institution because it gives you that social status of you're better than a slave, you're better than them. This was the Old South. Now, of course, there's going to be staunch resistance to this. And that resistance is something that we will see in our next lecture. But for now, just note, you see the next bullet point there is slave revolts. We'll talk about slave revolts in our next lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.